Russian involvement in Syria has been very heavy throughout the entire war. And it's
Hmm.
interesting because they also have strong relations with Israel, but they have strong relations with the Syrian government, and they're playing a very long game where, in which they have strong relations with Iran too, and they're playing so many sides.
Hmm.
But there's an interesting thing that they've been doing, and what's in the news at the moment for those who are paying attention, and is that they have been beefing up the Syrian military technology. Um, Israel has been for a long time doing air raids over Syria and bombing things that they see as Iranian assets within Syria, which of course is a violation of the national airspace and all that. Um, and there is really no, in terms of international law and that kind of thing, it's not something that really can be legally justified. Uh, and so Russia has been supporting the Syrian national government, the government of Bashar al-Assad, for the entire war. However, Russia has been, plays a game where they support to a degree. I feel like the U.S. does this too, where it's like, well, we're going to support you to a degree. We'll give you certain weapons. We won't give you other weapons. And Russia recently apparently has grown tired of Israeli airstrikes within Syria, and so they've given Syrians better anti-aircraft weapons. This is the claim that the Syrian government is making, that they've shot most of the Israeli missiles out of the sky before they hit. So it seems like, in a way, Russia is trying to. Seems to always try to keep everything at a stalemate.
So here's the thing with Russia. Russia's primary goals in Syria are geopolitical for sure. As we mentioned, they've always wanted to have a strong presence in the Middle East. The Middle East had been traditionally seen as, um, if we're talking about, especially in like the Cold War, from the Cold War perspective or Cold War context, America's sphere, right? For the most part, if we're talking about the Gulf, Egypt, Israel, there are other states that fell outside of that, of course, including Syria.
Well, since
But
the 70s, so I mean, like, Egypt was, much more flirting with the Soviet Union until
right, I'm saying
that.
like, yeah, but like after the Arab Israeli wars were
Yeah,
over,
like after
right?
79.
Yeah, so the Russians, especially with the Soviet decline, didn't have very much influence in the region, as much as they would have liked or used to, of course. So so
Okay.
now what they're doing is they're right, like, so regaining more political influence in the region. I mean, the Russians have a long list of issues in their, like, let's say, call it its political portfolio with the other big powers of the world, most
Uh,
importantly the United States, including like nuclear talks, including Ukraine,
sure.
including how Russia's aggressiveness is towards the U.S. And so Syria is one piece of that
Yeah.
giant puzzle. And so it's an important piece from the geopolitical perspective. But then from an economic perspective, the Russians are very, very interested in um, going in and developing Syria's oil and gas capabilities.
Yeah.
So Syria doesn't have very much
Is it
oil,
all
but
that much?
it doesn't have very much oil, but it has a lot of gas.
Yeah.
So undiscovered gas. So we're
Okay,
at
but
a
I'm gonna have to
point where
disagree. I'm gonna have to disagree with you on one thing, and this is going to be a comedic aside, is that well, Russia may not have had a lot of political influence in the Middle East during the 80s and 90s and the early 2000s. They were involved very much in the drug and prostitution industry in the Middle East.
right.
you gotta you
Nah,
gotta
man.
you gotta mention those exports that we don't talk
those
about all that much.
those exports, dude. I have a friend who's American. You know, she's a white girl, and she's blonde haired, blue eyed. She lives in Jordan. Everyone thinks she's a Russian prostitute.
It's
This
such a huge thing. I mean, it's ridiculous. It's one
I
of
feel
Russia's
sad.
major.
Like I feel really bad for her. It's
No,
just
it's
terrible,
terrible.
man.
No, and I mean, this is one of the reasons why it's hard to be a white woman visiting the Middle East, because everyone
Mhm.
just kind of assumes you're a hooker.
Yeah. It's terrible, man. I mean,
but so that was my comedic aside. But
right.
when we're talking about major exports and that, like Syria's major resource has been being, strategically located
Mhm.
between the oil countries of the Gulf and Israel and Iraq, and, that oil industry. It's like the location has been something that it's used as a bargaining chip, that it's just like it's right at the juncture of so many different countries that are
Mhm.
involved in different types of conflict and negotiations with each other. So they've used that as leverage. It's part of why they get Iran to support them, is their location.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's Syria's location is, I mean, it's prime when it comes to geopolitics, and
Yeah.
but not only that, even within Syria, you have so many different uh, ethnic groups and religious groups, and like it's not a very it's a very complex place. It's a very complex society, and so that's, I think, one of the major reasons why a lot of countries, the big countries, were very hesitant to really get involved. And you know, what you were
Well,
saying about the US, well, they did get involved, but not in a sense where they would. It was they knew that this would be a very messy involve. It would be a very messy involvement, right?
yeah, but it's
The
it's
thing is,
similar. It's similar to Lebanon, in which when other countries do get involved, they pick a group to be
right, but
their
Lebanon,
their people on
Lebanon
the
is
ground.
just Lebanon. I mean, with all due respect to anyone who is Lebanese, but Lebanon is, for the big powers, much easier to control. If they wanted to control it, they could. I think that if the big powers really wanted to invest in Lebanon, or sort of direct it in one way or another, it's a lot easier to manage than Syria. Syria is just it's I mean, yeah, you have that complexity in Lebanon, but it's in a tiny space, right? Whereas Syria,
Yeah.
it's just spread out, and you have so many different borders and people coming in and out, and it's just a lot more difficult to manage. I'm not saying Lebanon's easy by any means, but
Well,
but
I mean,
um
I think when we're talking about that in one way, it should be acknowledged that these borders are also artificial, and
Of course.
you know what I mean, like there's a spectrum of, you know, like there's a culture of Damascus, there's a culture of Beirut, there's a culture of this city, that city, you know, there's a culture of Jerusalem, but really, like, you know, that whole area, you know, was one province before World War I. Like, is what's now Israel, the Palestinian territories, Lebanon, Syria, and I think parts of Jordan were all considered one large
Yeah,
province, and it was
Bilad
open
Shem.
borders, and there, you know, so the ethnic ties, the family ties, the religious ties, you know, extend across borders.
Yeah,
And
and it's interesting. Like you look at a place like, let's say, Beirut or
yeah,
Jerusalem. I, as a Damascene, so someone who's from
yeah,
Damascus, would probably have more in common culturally with someone who's from Beirut or from Jerusalem than I would with someone who is from
like
uh, a
rural
village right
Syria.
outside
Yeah.
outside of Damascus.
Mhm.
Like that's
Yeah,
the thing. You have urban culture, rural culture, you have ethnic culture, different ethnic cultures,
yeah, it's
religious
like,
groups.
you know, like the Druze and the Maronites on like
Mhm.
Jebel Lebanon. You know what I mean? Like that's, you know what I mean, that's its own culture there. I mean,
Yeah.
it's like two cultures that basically were, you know, had a civil war in the 1840s over, you know, control. But that was, you know, Lebanon, the borders of Lebanon, like where do you draw them? Like there's, you know, there's a whole joke that, you know, after World War II, that the border of, I think I might have mentioned this on another podcast, but that when they were drawing the borders
Is
of
that with
the Middle
Jordan?
East, yeah, that when Jordan, there's
Oh
a
yeah, I
weird
know this
little
one.
hit, like dip in like Jordan's border is like a straight line on this one side, and there's like a little dip, and the joke is that Winston Churchill was drunk and he had a hiccup when he was drawing it. And it, you know what I mean, I'm
That's
sure
pretty
it's a
hilarious.
myth, you know, I'm sure it's a myth, but the point is,
It's how
where do
ridiculous
you
these
draw the
borders
line?
are.
It's like drawing the line between Mexico and New Mexico and California.
And
You know
that
what I mean?
that dip is in the middle of the desert. There's nothing there.
Yeah, so what's the
Like,
point? They're like, we're gonna fight over like who owns this little dip in the desert. You know, I mean, you know, but you know, like the border between Jordan and Iraq and Kuwait and all the, you know, I mean, like,
uh,
definitely within urban centers there's a certain identity and culture, and within rural areas there's identity and culture, but like when you draw lines in the sand, literally,
mhm.
um although I would also add, everyone thinks the Middle East is all sand. It's not. They have trees
Mhm.
there too.
They have
There's
mountains, they have rivers, there's snow, there's
Yeah, I mean, the Lebanese flag has a tree on it because they have these
yeah.
beautiful cedar forests, which are really impressive to see. Actually, if you go up in the hills there in the cedar
Mhm.
forest, but yeah, I mean, it's not all sand. That's a side.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I wanted to get back to the Russian
Yeah.
economic point. So Syria, along with a bunch of other countries in the Eastern Mediterranean, have, like, they've discovered that there are a lot of gas reserves in the
Mm,
sea, in the Mediterranean Sea, and there is this like big jostle and fighting going on, like political tensions between countries of drawing where the maritime borders are because of this. But Syria hasn't been able to develop any gas fields because of
uh,
the conflict. And so the Russians, their whole thing was, we'll get involved, we'll defend the regime. So they came in with the air force, their own air force, and
mm,
they pretty much pummeled most of the country, along with the government's air force, and in exchange for a lot of tenders and contracts
Mhm.
for the future, right? So that when Syria's conflict ends, the Russians can come in and develop those fields and profit a great deal. Now, this makes total sense because Russia's economy is primarily oil and gas based, and Putin and his ruling class, let's say the elites of Russia, they're all that's all they care about. It's not ideological for them. There is no ideology. It's purely profit and going in and
Yeah.
trying to
mm,
extract resources from different parts of the world. And so that's the Russian goal right there.